Peter Zeihan. Peter, thanks a lot for joining us. The book's amazing, and you claim globalism is in trouble, on the verge of potentially collapsing, threatening the world, as we know it now. Explain what does that mean? I mean, I think the coronavirus pandemic showed us how weak global supply chains can be.
Sure. Let's just make sure we're talking about the right thing here. Same thing, not globalism, globalization. The whole idea that you have this single global economic system where we sell what we're good at and we buy what we're not good at. That was a relatively new concept that really only dates back to 1950, when the United States created globalization as a way to induce countries to join us in the Cold War. But you may have noticed the Cold War ended a while ago, and Americans have become less interested ever since. So the whole concept of supply chains, whether it's in energy or manufacturing, is now breaking down. And we're seeing the first big pieces fall out of the system right now with the Ukraine war and the China breakdown. And that's going to leave a very different world just a year from now.
One of the things I've heard you say in interviews before is that America's in a really good position to deal with this. I mean, that's some good news. I don't want to put lipstick on this, but what do you mean by that?
Well, it will be a pretty pig, so you'll use all the lipstick you want. The United States is the world's largest producer and exporter of food products, and we're the world's largest producer and second largest exporter of energy products. So even in the worst case scenarios, the lights are going to stay on, no one's going to starve. Also, keep in mind, the things that we do subsidize don't really distort the market all that much. So if you increase the cost of wheat by 100% globally, that causes an Arab Spring. But in the United States, it only increases the cost of a loaf of bread by 25 cents. That's something we can deal with.
And Peter, I was reading something about China. They have obviously a rather large land mass, but not a lot of that land is usable for creating their own domestic food supply. That's why they've been buying up farmland, agricultural land around the world. I guess you just kind of hit it. It's one of our comparative advantages, isn't it? Having all this arable land we can use to plant our own food while other countries don't have that?
Well, however bad the situation you think is in China, it's probably worse. They actually have less usable farmland per person there than Saudi Arabia does. So they are utterly dependent, not just on food imports, but importing the energy and the fertilizer components to even allow them to grow what they do grow. So if you break down the globalized system, there is no way that China emerges from this with a population over 650 million. That's a loss of almost 750 million people in a very short period of time.
Gosh, incredible information. It's a great book. Peter, thanks for coming on. Appreciate your time.
Anytime.
So we have multitudes of farmers around the world who have had to do something different. In the United States, we've seen significant crop switching from things like corn or soy to hay. And in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of farmers are just choosing to not use fertilizer because they can't afford it. We won't fully understand just how bad this is going to be until we get to the first couple of weeks of September. That's when we'll get our first real understanding of just how poor the coming harvest is going to be. And this is just the start of a very long process. It takes a minimum of 3 years to bring a new fertilizer plant online. And we have not even started a large-scale replacement system. Some countries like the US and Canada and Mexico are taking steps, but you shouldn't expect to see the beginning of that success until we get to the end of 2025. And by then, we will have years of famine on multiple continents in our back pocket. One of the reasons why you follow vegetable oil is in places in the world that do not have reliable electricity, frying is one of the few ways that you can prepare animal protein at volume. So food oils are critical for over half of the planet's population. Ukraine by itself is the world's single largest supplier of sunflower oil, and they're about 70% of the market all by themselves. And so anyone else who is in the food oil business, whether it is soy or palm or whatever, has felt the pressure as people have shifted to alternatives, and there just isn't that much liquidity in the market. It's starting right now with price pressure, but not necessarily high shortages, because we have, quote, only, unquote, lost Ukraine at this point. But by the time we get to the fourth quarter of this year, it'll be apparent just how bad the fertilizer issue is. We only have about 2 months of global storage for wheat. Half of that is in China, and the Chinese storage system does not regulate temperature or humidity. So usually half of what they have in storage rots. So we're going to chew through the entire global storage capacity this year. And then the abject shortages will start very early next.
I think that I read somewhere that Indonesia for a while had cut off the export of palm oil, I think precisely because they were worried that their own people would be out of the ability to cook and to produce food. They've now, I think, recently restarted it, but it was sort of a signal of what we're going to be seeing, I think, around the world.
Absolutely. We've already had about 30 countries that have some sort of agricultural restriction on exports, ranging from food oils to some of the cheaper proteins to certainly all the sorts of grains. We're going to be seeing a lot more of that moving forward. Some of them, like Indonesia, have managed to achieve that saturation that they were trying for, and it has been successful. But every time one country does it, it puts pressure on all of the others. So the more internationalized a sector, the faster you can get to a price runaway structure. And again, September, that's what to watch for.
When Callisto was the ambassador to the Vatican, we got to know Governor Beasley pretty well, who just got the Nobel Prize for the World Food Organization. I mean, he's predicting tens of millions of people starving to death and just saying that it's probably beyond our ability to fix now.
It is beyond our ability to fix. Agriculture is the most vulnerable sector. If you have disruptions in heavy equipment or in energy or in transport, agriculture doesn't just simply take a hit. It can take a hit that cannot even be attempted to recover from until at least the next planting season. So right now, the damage has already been done. And until we can build out an alternate supply system for these components, you should not expect much improvement. Instead, you should be expecting increasingly cascading failures. A good example is what's going on with the European sanctions on Russia right now. The Europeans are putting the finishing touches on a sanctions package that will ban maritime insurers from insuring cargo in Russian ports. That means we're not just losing the Russian stuff, we're losing all of the Russian stuff downstream throughout the entire system. That is going to hit agriculture harder than anywhere else. I'm obviously worried about the Middle East because the last time we had a disruption out of the Russian space, we generated the Arab Spring and the Syrian civil war. But I'm even more worried about South Asia, which depends upon this part of the world for their fertilizer sourcing. Brazil's in a similar bucket. Not that I expect anyone in Brazil to starve, but 85% of their fertilizers do come from the Russian space. They're okay for this planting season, but they usually do 2 crops a year, and it's unclear where they're going to get their inputs for the next one.
We're used to trade, physical transport on the water being safe and cheap. And that's just not the case anymore. We had the Europeans step up to the plate with their oil embargo for Russian crude this week. And the most important part of that is they're banning all insurance for all vessels that carry Russian product. That's the start of the unraveling of what makes transport globally. Mm-hmm. And since in the case of manufactured goods, the average product crosses international borders 100 times. And in East Asia, every single one of those crossings is by water. The ability of this to disintegrate very quickly is something we have not priced in. Well, the biggest counter, of course, is the Chinese are still there. There's very little about the Chinese system that any standard economist is going to be able to look at and say, oh, yeah, that's going to last. But yet they are still here 30 years on. The issue to watch with China now is that their labor costs have increased at a faster clip than at any time in history in any country, including the Black Death. They're now at about 14 or 15 times the labor costs that they had back in 1999, but their labor productivity has only gone up by a factor of 2 or 3. They're dying. One-child policy 40 years on, combined with the world's most rapid urbanization, there just aren't enough people under age 35 in China left to even theoretically repopulate the country. And if the more recent data that's come out of the Chinese census is accurate, they overcounted their population in excess of 100 million people, most of whom would have been women. So we were already looking at one of the 2 or 3 most fastest aging countries in the world before this. Now they're on a completely different scale. And even with the old data, the younger data, they aged past the United States back in 2017. So we're looking at a country that is going from pre-industrial standards of subsistence agriculture to a complete post-industrial collapse within a lifetime with 20 years to spare. So I am not making a prediction on specifically how it will go down. There are just too many paths forward. Sometimes it is overnight. Sometimes it's over a year. Sometimes it's over a generation. Demographics gives us a hard stop of 10 years. So it's between now and then on some sort of time frame. As for
very soon.
Yeah, it's very, very soon. Geopolitically speaking, this is practically a blink in an eye, demographically speaking as well. But let's talk about that finance model, because that kind of puts to pain the entire idea that the Chinese are good planners. They're really not. The whole idea of the Asian financial model is that capital, cash, whatever it happens to be, is a good of the state. It exists to serve political purposes, not economic ones. So in the United States, if you take out a loan, you have to show a business plan, you have to offer collateral, and if you don't follow your plan or if you don't pay back your loan, you lose your collateral. This is what we consider normal. That is not how it works in China. In China, you have to show your employment plan. And if you can guarantee a large number of people will be working at a job, regardless of what that job does, you get money, because it's all about preventing large groups of workers from going on long walks together. Development from an American point of view is about building infrastructure, building productive capacity, serving a market, growing the business. In China, it's about achieving strategic goals, making sure that the population doesn't rebel, making sure they can dominate specific industries, not on efficiency or on cost, but simply because of mass output. So they put a lot of cash into industrial plant, not to produce anything in particular, just to produce a lot of stuff. And this is one of the many ways that the Chinese ended up going from being a backwards country to producing more steel and more cement than the rest of the world combined as recently as 7 years ago. And then they just have to dump it on the international market because there's not even a capacity in China to absorb it all. That's incidentally one of the reasons why One Belt, One Road is out there. It's a product disposal program. There we go.
Yeah.
Too many words too early in the morning. Moving forward, you can apply this to every sector of the Chinese system. And in the sectors where the Chinese are not as productive, they have to put more and more cash behind it, and it's more and more wasteful. So the overall sector that is most exposed to this sort of financing is agriculture. Chinese land writ large is only about 1/5 the productivity of the global average. So they have to put in scads more, in case of some fertilizers, 5 and 6 times as much to get the same amount of calories out. It's particularly bad with infrastructure. We are now in the early stages of the Chinese following the Japanese program of building roads to places where no one lives. And of course, we've all heard about the ghost cities. These are not the plans of a country that is planning 30, 40, 50 years down the line. These are the operations of a country that has one goal: make sure there's not an internal rebellion. Now, separate from the book, separate from the long-term situation, we've had a government collapse in China over the last year. Xi is now exiled or imprisoned or executed pretty much everyone in the country who is capable of independent thought. And so we're now getting these catastrophic country-wide policies because it's a cult of personality. Nobody wants to bring him any information, but if he gives a speech on TV, they take that as their marching orders and they interpret that the way they think that the guy who kills the messenger wants it to be interpreted. So this is how you get places in Shanghai, like literally going out and disinfecting the runways. Just ridiculous policies from a health and a development point of view. And it's happening in electricity, it's happening in transport, it's happening in manufacturing. And so we even got Apple, like the quintessential American company that has outsourced its entire supply chain. Every time there's been a writing on the wall that there's a genocide or there's a crackdown in Hong Kong or there's inefficiency or labor costs are going, every single time that something has come up, Apple has doubled down on China. So now 92%, I believe, of their supply chain is internal to China. And even they started looking last month at other options for the first time.